is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Pay heed all who enter and beware this podcast. That's right, this is the Pay Heed podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network, covering all things Kansas football and basketball. I'm Nick Springer alongside Kevin Flaherty. We are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. As we continue through our off-season series of the Jayhawk Rewind, looking back at KU's games from 2023, breaking them down, seeing what we can maybe take away that for 2024. And as we get into conference play, the conversation is going to get a lot more interesting, Kevin, because we are going to get into some games where it's going to be opponents that KU will have again in 2024. Sure. So there will be a lot to take away. As always, if you like the show, if you like what you're listening to or watching, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the like, subscribe button, leave us a comment, let us know your thoughts, share your feelings. If you think we suck, you can say we suck, whatever, fine, it doesn't matter. Just leave us a comment, rating, review, whatever you may be. So, as I said, we're doing the Jayhawk Rewind here with Week 5 now for KU football. Week 5, Kansas 4-0. We talked last week after their win against BYU. That was their conference opener, the conference opener for BYU as a member of the Big 12. And that was a big one for Kansas because they remain undefeated. They're 4-0. And now that sets up this gigantic matchup with Texas, who was also undefeated, top 5 team in the country. They had beaten Alabama in the non-con. So this was looking like it was going to be a real clash of top 25 teams. Kansas ended up entering the top 25 rankings this week against Texas. And after the game against BYU, Jalen Daniels' numbers weren't crazy, but he made some great plays and helped Kansas get the win, obviously, over BYU. Over the course of this week heading into this game, Kevin, I got to be honest. As we got further along in the week, I convinced myself more and more that Kansas could go into Austin and win this game. What was kind of your thoughts heading into this one for KU? Undefeated, going to Austin to face the big bad Texas Longhorns. Texas might actually be back. I don't know, maybe. What were your thoughts going into this one?
Yeah, what a difference 2 years makes for both teams, right? Because the previous time they were in Austin, obviously Kansas pulls out the win in overtime. It serves as kind of Jalen Daniels' emergence game, if you will. Kind of put Jared Casey on the map. He wasn't even supposed to be on the field, and it kind of jump-started his whole career. Texas wound up not going to a bowl that year. KU, was 2-10. That was their second win of the season, but they did play really well, against TCU, their next game in the loss, and then played a tight one with West Virginia as well in another loss that kind of gave you optimism heading into the next season. And Kansas kind of used that stretch, I feel like, to propel themselves to a bowl game. Texas, they kind of remade the roster after losing to KU in that game. They wound up being significantly better the next year, came into Lawrence, kind of handled Kansas in Lawrence in that game. Now you have the return trip to Austin. Kansas is looking like a better team than they were the previous year. Texas is looking like a better team. But one of the things that you didn't mention, they beat Alabama and they stopped the run. You didn't, mention that. They were the more physical team, and I think that made Texas kind of scary in this one. But they followed that up with not a great performance against Wyoming. And so if you're looking at this from Kansas's standpoint, you're saying, well, gosh, like Texas in the past, right? Like when people had said, hey, Texas is back or whatever else, a lot of times they followed that up with a dud performance or two. And the Wyoming game was kind of a dud for them. It was, maybe closer than they would have liked, wasn't especially comfortable. You had the game against Oklahoma the next week. And so you're looking at it as kind of, is this a little bit of a trap game? As much of a trap game between two ranked teams could be, Texas coming off a game where it was kind of sleepy. Kansas, coming off a win against BYU, having a lot of confidence, just got ranked. Jalen Daniels, like you said, I mean, he didn't have to throw the ball a lot in the second half against BYU, was 4 for 4 in that second half with 2 touchdowns. So did what he needed to do. And I'll be honest with you, Nick, as a Kansas guy or whatever, and with it being the last time that Kansas was going to take a trip to Austin, barring, some sort of potential non-conference matchup in the future, my wife and I got tickets and we went down there. And with me having covered Texas, in the past, it was kind of like, hey, this could be my last chance to catch a KU Texas game in Austin. And so I don't know that I necessarily thought going in like, hey, Kansas is going to win. But I was like you in that I kind of talked myself into this is a game where Kansas is going to have a very real chance. And I think if you watch the Kansas game from the previous year, Texas won on the lines of scrimmage, but Kansas also really protected Jalen Daniels in that game. It was his first game back after suffering his shoulder injury. Didn't really use a lot of quarterback run game, kind of used him as a decoy. And Texas called Kansas's bluff, right? They basically said, you're not having Jalen Daniels keep that ball. And they did a nice job of shutting down the KU run game. And so, at least for myself, and this is a really long-winded way to put it, Jalen Daniels used his legs really well against BYU. It was kind of like, okay, let's see this matchup on more equal footing when Kansas is willing to run Jalen Daniels, when Texas knows Jalen can run and has to account for that. Ultimately, though, that didn't wind up being a factor in this one.
Yeah, obviously, on like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the game week leading up to this one, the thought process was, okay, Jalen Daniels is an X factor level player.
Sure.
And even in a game where maybe you are a bit outmatched in other areas, if you're KU talent-wise, Jalen Daniels, preseason Big 12 player of the year. If he can go out and make enough plays to keep Kansas in this game, maybe you put some game pressure on Texas, right? Bill Self on the basketball side always talks about game pressure. This would be a situation where, hey, put some game pressure on Texas, right? They're at home. They beat Alabama. They're a top 5 team. They think they're going to the college football playoff. If it's a tight game late, maybe that can help, in Kansas's favor. And so that really seemed to be the case of, hey, Jalen Daniels, if he can be the X factor, then that could potentially have Kansas be in a position to maybe late in this game win, right? And then I think the other side of that discussion with Quinn Ewers for Texas was, hey, he's got all the talent in the world, but he is mistake prone, right? If you can force him into some mistakes, force him some turnovers, maybe that's where Kansas can capitalize as well. But then that whole conversation, as you alluded to, went out the window. As about 45 minutes from kickoff, Jalen Daniels was word started coming out that he was not going to be available for this game for Kansas. There was the infamous backpack photo of him walking into the stadium with a backpack on, and then people were thinking that the backpack re-aggravate his back injury or whatever, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is, literally within 30 minutes of the game, I think you had Molly McGrath coming on and being like, well, Jalen Daniels is out, actually, blah, blah, blah. And I got to be honest, it was pretty devastating. I mean, I don't know about you, but for someone like me who is a bit younger, thinking back to like the Orange Bowl years and whatnot, when I was younger for that kind of stuff, I mean, this was one of the games, like one of the most highly anticipated games for me, really, in my KU experience, because I was younger for some of those other games. You think back to like KU, Missouri, and those games, and then the Arkansas game the previous year was a big deal. But I don't know. This was a game that I was legitimately like fired up for, excited for, and then to have that deflating moment of your Big 12 preseason player of the year at quarterback is not going to play on the road in the biggest game in the last couple of years, I think, for Kansas in the regular season, certainly. It was a real gut punch. And you obviously had a different experience on that because you were at the stadium as a fan.
Yeah, and you described this on the BYU episode as a litmus test game. You kind of felt like, okay, Illinois maybe wasn't quite as good as some people thought. The defense maybe wasn't quite as good. Kansas marched up and down the field on that one. You beat Nevada, who is not very good. You beat an FCS team. You beat BYU. How good is Kansas really? And this was your chance to see, is Kansas a legitimate Big 12 title contender? Because that was something that the players had kind of talked about, like that they wanted that to sort of be the goal. And so you wanted that in the stands. You didn't hear anything about it. My first indicator that Jalen Daniels was not playing was when Jason Bean came out for the first play. And when he came out for the first play, I'll be honest with you, he came out for the first play and I thought, okay, maybe there's a trick play. Andy Kotelnicki, maybe there's a trick play or some reason. Maybe I didn't see Jalen lined up at wide receiver or something like that. The second play, he's still out there, and you just kind of say, I guess Jalen Daniels isn't out here. And at that point, and we're going to get into Jason Bean a lot over these episodes, Jason Bean was terrific at the end of the year, really was playing a high-level quarterback. At that point, he hadn't really shown that consistently, though. And you add in the fact that Jalen was supposed to play all week, and so that's a tough task for anybody, Nick. When somebody else is getting the reps, when somebody else is getting the preparation, when you're preparing to back them up or whatever, and then you find out pretty quickly, like, hey, it's me. That's tough on anybody, and I think Bean went on to have a really good season, but I think that was just such an impossible situation to be thrown into. Okay, you're our starting quarterback at number 3 Texas in this litmus test game. I feel like even if Jason Bean was playing at the level that he was at the end of the year, that's such a tough ask for any young quarterback.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, you think about the arc of Jason Bean, and you mentioned it. We'll probably be diving into it a lot more as we go through the series and through the rest of the season. Of at the end of 2022, there was probably a decent chunk of KU fans that would have been happy to see Jason Bean not return to this team. And with kind of the way things ended with that last play against Arkansas, and it really did seem like maybe he was trending towards just hanging it up, being done. And the KU coaching staff kind of went to him and ultimately. Kind of talked to him and had him end up coming back to the team. And that ended up being a real lifesaver for this KU football team, because otherwise you would have been looking at rolling out Cole Ballard, which, a walk-on true freshman, at Texas. So, yeah, kind of a blessing in disguise there for Jason Bean to come back. But yeah, for this game specifically, at that moment, he had not become sort of the, I don't know, folk hero that he is now, I guess, so to speak. At this point, he was still maybe a guy that people didn't have that much faith in. But like you said, I mean, you could toss anybody out there, I think, in this scenario, and it would have been very difficult. So for Jason Bean to have to step into the situation, I think it was going to be a challenge regardless. So we'll be breaking down this game coming up next. But first, got to tell you about our sponsors at Home Field Apparel. You can head to homefieldapparel.com to get some of the best college and professional gear around as well. They got over 130 different colleges, including Kansas. Obviously, got Jayhawk's good shirt here. From Home Field Apparel. They've got over 40 different Kansas items. They've got vintage retro shooting shirts for basketball. They've got an Orange Bowl shirt as well. Different stuff that you can get over at homefieldapparel.com. If you use the promo code KCSN23, you'll get 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. That's promo code KCSN23, 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. We're back with more here on the Pay You Podcast right after this.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
This is the Pay You Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer along with Kevin Flaherty. Be sure to leave us a like, comment, subscribe, whether you're listening or watching us on YouTube. Thanks so much for listening and tuning in. And leave us a 5-star rating and review as well if you're listening on Apple or Spotify also. Okay, so the mood, obviously, of this game changed dramatically between Kansas and Texas once you realized that Jalen Daniels was not going to be in the game. And now it just kind of became a situation where thinking, oh, man, we could actually maybe go win this game. Now it just went into a situation where just don't lose by 100. Okay. Just don't lose by 100. So it's kind of crazy how quickly that changed. But yeah, going into this game, it gets started and Texas looks pretty good early, right? Kansas, unfortunately, with Jason Bean out there, they're not really able to do much on their first drive. Texas gets the ball, pretty much goes right down the field and scores a touchdown on their first drive. Quinn Ewers went through the ball to Adonai Mitchell, 3 consecutive plays for big chunk yardage against Kansas. They go down the field. They ultimately get the touchdown. And just like that, you're down 7-0, and you're maybe not feeling too great if you're Kansas at this point early in the game. I guess, Kevin, you kind of mentioned there, obviously, with you being in the stands once you realized Jalen Daniels wasn't going to play. I mean, did your expectations change at all for the game like I was discussing there? I mean, did you just get the sense of, hey, let's not get guys hurt, let's not lose by 100, or what was kind of your thoughts after kind of letting it sink in that you were going to be using Jason Bean through this game?
Yeah, I think it was more, just try and hang around a little bit. Not necessarily you're gonna win, but you talked about the game pressure aspect of it. Your chances to win, probably dropped fairly significantly at that point. And so you were kind of like, if you lose and it's close, it's not the worst thing in the world. Just try and hang around. And if something good happens where you have a chance to win it at the end, great, but don't get run off the field. That first drive, I think they did have one really good run on an option play to kind of start things off. The drive kind of dies down at that point. And we've talked on this before about how Kansas's defense had been kind of vulnerable to QB scrambles. In fairness, it's tough to defend those things, but Kansas gets Texas into a 3rd and 9 at the 30, where you're looking at potentially a somewhat long field goal if you're able to get a stop there. Instead, Kansas is playing, man, I think behind the defensive line. A hole kind of opens up. People have their backs to Quinn Ewers, and he breaks like a 30-yard scramble touchdown. And at that point, you're just kind of like, okay, survival mode is kicking in.
Yeah. At that point, I think the concern level was pretty high of this could get ugly pretty quick down in Austin. Kansas's next drive, there was a drive there where, once again, you mentioned they had a nice play to Devin Neal on their first drive. The next drive, when they're down 7-0, they had another nice play to Devin Neal that got called back by what I think was just an incredibly bogus holding penalty on Jared Casey. I thought it was terrible. I think it's terrible a year later. I was very upset with this next drive for Kansas. They had a deep pass from Jason Dean to Trevor Wilson that they couldn't connect on over the middle on a 3rd down play near midfield. That would have been that was sort of a play where, I didn't have a lot of these plays over the course of the season, but I think, like we mentioned with Jason Bean, in this particular context, with the fact that it was so fresh in your mind that you could have had Jalen Daniels playing in this game before he was ruled out, that pass to Trevor Wilson, that was a pass where in my mind I thought, oh, man, like it was right there. Maybe with Jalen Daniels to make the play, but Trevor Wilson dropped it. So tough break there for Kansas. And then you're down 7-0, you're punting the ball again, and now you're really, really concerned at this point.
Yeah, and I think Texas presented so many troubles for anybody with that offense. For one thing, they were really physical up front. They were maybe the most physical team in the Big 12. I mean, like we talked about, they were more physical than Alabama in going into Tuscaloosa, and that doesn't happen super often. Jonathan Brooks was an unbelievable running back, and actually, his injury, I don't want to say it cost Texas a national title, but it might have cost him a shot at a national title because the first guy almost never got him, and certainly didn't against Kansas. And so when you watch that, even when they didn't block things perfectly, he was able to kind of help make that up, and he could have really helped them against Washington in a game where Texas obviously was throwing into the end zone on the last play of the game with a chance on that one. But I think one of the areas where they really gave Kansas a lot of issues was it's tough for anybody to guard Xavier Worthy, who is now with the Chiefs. Kansas, has a better number one cornerback than most people when you look at Kobe Bryant. And Melo Dotson is a pretty good number 2 corner. But my gosh, A.D. Mitchell would have been a number 1 wide receiver on so many teams. And so to have him as that number 2 wideout where he's working against your number 2 corner, then you've got Jordan Whittington, working against, your number 3 corner, a linebacker, or a safety. It was just one of those situations where Texas always seemed to have 1 or 2 more weapons than Kansas could account for with its personnel.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. Just go down the list, right? You start with Quinn Ewers, who, again, definitely has the talent. There's no denying that. And obviously, he had a strong season last year and was playing well at this point. You mentioned Jonathan Brooks, who, barring the torn ACL, you mentioned the possibility of him helping Texas win the national title. But just beyond that, I mean, by not tearing his ACL, maybe he gets drafted as one of the top running backs in the draft.
Sure.
And then you go to the wide receiver position, and you mentioned it with Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell, 2 really, really elite receivers, obviously. Then you throw in Jatavian Sanders at tight end. as well, who is just a guy that is impossible, who was impossible to cover. And it just felt like no matter what Kansas could do defensively from a schematic standpoint, there was going to be a mismatch somewhere on the field for Texas, right? And that's just, and listen, the reality is that has been a reality for Kansas on defense for a very long time, when they just didn't necessarily have the same caliber of athlete as some of these other Big 12 schools. And Kansas has obviously done a great job to sort of, remedy that under Lance Leipold with some of the talent they have on the defensive side. But listen, Texas is and always has been kind of in a class of their own with the talent. Sometimes it's been the scheming stuff where they've struggled, but with Steve Sarkisian, I know he's such a great, especially early in games, planning out drives and whatnot. And so Texas did have success early. They had a long drive, by the way. So at this point, you're still down 7-0 if you're Kansas. And Texas puts together a very, very long 14-play, 6.5-minute field goal drive. They get all the way down to the KU 8-yard line. Kansas is able to stop them. So Texas had a 1st and goal at the 8. They get an incompletion. They try to run the ball with Jonathan Brooks. Kansas stops them for no gain, which was a rarity, by the way, for that game if you watch the highlights. Then they go for another incomplete pass. And so I talked about this. Yes, I talked about this on the BYU show last week, Kevin. Kansas had a 6.5-minute field goal drive to end the game against BYU. And it was awesome, right? It was a 1-possession game. You had a chance to make a 2-possession game. Well, here Texas has a 6.5-minute field goal drive. And I am just shouting at the top of my lungs, yes, after they kick the field goal. Because it's how do we keep them out of the end zone there? It was an incredible, incredible feeling at that point. And I think for Texas, this is an interesting game as we kind of go through it, because I think from the Texas perspective, there's probably a lot of moments where you're thinking, man, we really could have blown Kansas out by a lot. And Kansas did manage to hang around. And this was an example of that, where Texas kind of just went down the field, but KU held them to the field.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I know this is going to sound kind of like a weird comparison, but, there are some of those dudes in the UFC who have just incredible chins, and people just, they unload on them, they punch them in the face about 35 times, and the guy's still coming, and you can just see it in their reaction, like, why is this guy still standing up? And I think, sitting with Texas fans around us and everything else, I think that was part of it. Like, they felt like, hey, we're controlling this game. This is a game that Texas is very obviously the better team. Why isn't this guy down yet? And that drive was the first of several drives where Texas didn't get ideal, scoring output out of it, and we'll get to it, but and get to it specifically. But this is a game that in the third quarter was still separated by 6 points up until late in the third quarter, and it should not have been. I mean, when you look at where Texas had the ball, the opportunities that Texas had versus the opportunities that Kansas had, it was like Texas had rained down 35 punches on Kansas's head, and Kansas is just kind of like, I didn't hear no bell, and so it was kind of a funny deal to see. And then Kansas, going down 10-0, answers back with one of the stranger plays that I think you saw all of last year.
Yeah, maybe one of the luckiest plays of the season for KU. If you're just box score watching, or if you just happen to be going back and reading through the plays, this probably just looks like, a regular touchdown play. No. There was nothing regular about this play. So Kansas, they end up moving the ball on the field pretty effectively on the next drive. They get a couple decent passes from Jason Bean. You got one of Mason Fairchild. They got down near midfield to about the 45-yard line of Texas, and Jason Bean on an option play takes off and starts running on the sideline. And you're thinking, okay,
it breaks wide open. It breaks just wide open, and you're like, oh my gosh, look at this thing.
Yes. And then here comes Jalen Catalon, who absolutely destroys Jason Bean on the near sideline. The ball goes flying into the air, and by the grace of God, somehow ends up directly in the hands of Daniel Highshaw with nobody around him, and he goes and scores a touchdown.
Yeah. I mean, it was one of those things too. I think you could see Catalon flying up, and you felt like if he makes it miss, it's a touchdown here. Narrator, he did not make Jalen Catalon miss. Jalen Catalon absolutely went through Jason Bean and popped out the back of him pretty much. Yeah. Bean, I think, We get on players for fumbling, obviously. That was one where you could almost understand it just by the sheer force that he took. Like he said, though, Daniel Highshaw running down the field, was sort of right there. It almost came off like an option pitch. And actually sitting in the stands, I think that was the initial impression was, did he pitch that right before he got hit? No, he did not. He got lit up. That was a fumble. It worked out like an option pitch. Daniel Highshaw scoops it up, runs it in for a score, and just like that, one kind of fluky play, and it's 10-7.
Yeah, and a really fluky play at that for Kansas there. But listen, you take the points however you can get them in this situation, and you're right. At that point, you're down 10-7. This is still in the first quarter, by the way. Texas would eventually go down and respond to that touchdown with another field goal in which Kansas got a sack on a 2nd and goal to help kind of drive Texas back a little bit and force them to settle for yet another field goal to make it 13-7. And at that point, you're thinking, okay, another field goal, that's good. It's still one possession game. Kansas immediately goes 3 out on the next drive. Really nothing doing. Jason Bean this was a 3rd and 6 play. And, this is where people will probably try to criticize Jason Bean more, is on plays like this where he looks to scramble and I believe he slides short of the first down on this play on a 3rd and 6 in this situation. And that can be rather frustrating, I think, from the fan perspective. But it resulted in a 4th down, and Kansas kind of has to punt because they're deep in their own territory. Texas gets really good field position near midfield, and at this point, you're a little more concerned. Or no, they end up with not that great field position. They pin it back a little bit. Texas goes down, and again, they're able to get some chunk plays. Jonathan Brooks, you had mentioned it, seemingly would never go down with the first guy. He has a couple nice runs. But again, Kansas finds a way to stand tall, and they force a long field goal, a 50-yarder from Texas that they miss. Yep. So now you're thinking, wait a minute. Texas in 3 possessions has been stopped on goal-to-go situations twice for field goals. Now they miss a field goal. We might be, if you can just put together one drive here, and I've got that to me kind of became the story of the game. It's like, man, I understand Jason Bean's in a tough situation. I understand that he has been thrown into, not a great spot, but this is a 6-point game. If you can just make one play, right? If you can just make a couple plays here, maybe you have a chance. Well, unfortunately, that does not happen. Kansas, again, the Texas defense, too much for them. They don't really get anything again on the next drive. They go 3 and out again. And then Texas, once again, kind of goes up and down the field on Kansas. They had a couple penalties, actually, that slowed down their next drive. But it ends up resulting in a play in which now you're towards the end of the second quarter, and it's still a 6-point game. And you're thinking, okay, things are looking pretty good if you can just find a way to not let Texas score. Well, Texas starts going straight down the field, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, 20-7 at half feels like a nail in the coffin, really, given the circumstances. But then you get Cornell Wheeler making an interception on Quinn Ewers. And I kind of mentioned this, Quinn Ewers is prone to making mistakes, and here Cornell Wheeler makes a great play to prevent Texas from scoring at the end of the half. And in that moment, obviously, that felt very significant, right? Because it kept the game at a 1-possession game for Kansas and gave KU a little bit of momentum heading into the halftime as well. Momentum that they had really no business having, considering how much Texas had kind of dominated the first half. But Cornell Wheeler making an interception, and that kind of is a springboard to talk about Cornell Wheeler as a guy who is probably going to need to step up significantly more here in 2024 also.
Yeah, it was a great play, too. I mean, he absolutely, you could see Quinn Ewers' eyes kind of drifted underneath the throw that Ewers wanted to make. And it was a first down throw. Ewers didn't need to push that ball into danger at that point. And so when you look at it then, you're saying, man, Texas has had 4 drives in a row, 4 like drives, not had the ball forced in a row, had 4 drives in a row and gotten 6 total points. You had a missed field goal, an interception. Twice they get the ball inside the 10 and finish with the field goal. Defensively, even though Texas is going up and down the field, kind of at will, and you figure the defense can't hold on for much longer at that point. But defensively, for Texas to go in to halftime with 13 points, you really felt like they've done everything they can. The offense really needed to find a way to bail them out, because I don't know how you felt, watching it, Nick, but I'll tell you in the stadium, was there a little bit of nervousness? There was maybe a little bit in terms of the people around us, but for the most part, I think they felt like, well, this thing's going to pop open. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. And, that was kind of the way I felt. And talking to my wife, who was sitting next to me too, was kind of like, Kansas is a little fortunate to kind of be in this spot. They're very close to this potentially, getting away from them. They really need to go in and find something offensively. Otherwise, this thing's going to get out of hand. It was a hot day. I think it was like 91 at kickoff, but felt like it was, 100 plus. But the defense was out there a really long time, and so you really felt like if the offense didn't find any answers, this was going to get away from KU.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. I mean, Texas really dominated Kansas in the first half. KU had multiple 3-and-outs, drives where they just couldn't really get anything going. Jason Bean was not completing very many passes really at all, so there wasn't really much to speak of there for Kansas. And KU ended up finishing the game 0 for 8 on third downs. They didn't convert a single third down the whole game, which really killed a lot of their drives also. And so, I think the feeling at that point was, like I said, I think it was, man, if you can find a way to make like just a couple plays, and maybe the interception of Cordell Wheeler helps kind of steal some of that back to go into the halftime break. But in the end, Texas comes out to start the second half. They get the ball first, which was unfortunate. And Jonathan Brooks, man, a big-time run, a 55-yard touchdown run for Texas. He finally breaks one open. This I think certainly fits one of your sort of it was only a matter of time situations where with Brooks especially, he was breaking tackles left and right. It felt like he was going to spring one eventually, and sure enough, he springs one to start the second half to sort of rip that momentum back for Texas and make it 20-7.
Yeah. You were in a situation where it was 3rd and 8 on the third play of the drive. Maybe your chance to get off the field. Quinn Ewers runs for 10 yards. Again, issues with scrambling stuff, et cetera. And so it was one of those things where, it felt like they were playing with danger kind of all along, and then the danger happened. They didn't have to worry about scoring in the red zone. They didn't have to worry about extending a drive when Jonathan Brooks runs in from 54 yards out. I think he had a 67-yard run earlier in the game where Kobe Bryant ran him down at like the 8 or so that ended up turning into a field goal. But at that point, you've given up multiple 50-plus yard runs. This one resulted in 7 points. And just like that, Kansas is kind of behind the 8 ball that they had just avoided before the half.
Yeah, Brooks ended the game with 218 yards. He was really doing it all for Texas. And at that point, like you mentioned, is it okay? Is this thing going to pop now? What's the concern level here? Well, Kansas responds. One of the things about Jason Bean, and anybody who watched Jason Bean knows this, is that he is a guy who he will throw the ball down the field. He is not afraid to take some chances. He's not afraid to put the ball in the air. He has a great arm throwing the ball downfield. He completes a long pass to Jared Casey on this drive for Kansas that kind of gets him going a little bit. And that sets up a deep touchdown pass to Trevor Wilson. And Trevor Wilson is really carved out his role for this team, I think, as the speed guy, right? The speed guy, the guy that has a burner. And Jason Bean ends up finding him for a 58-yard touchdown pass. And this was a moment where it was like, okay, there's one of the plays that you need if you're Kansas to kind of still hang around in this one. And that cuts it back to a 6-point game very quickly. That drive took less than 2 minutes for Kansas to answer back and make it 20-14.
Yeah, so in the Big 12, there's a concept that everybody runs as a quarters beater. It's called mills, basically, where the inside guy runs a crossing route, and you're trying to get the safety to jump that, and there's a post kind of over the top, over his head if he does come up, and it's really hard for the corner, to get on top of that post if the safety does come up. If the safety doesn't come up, you've got the nice little crossing route over the middle. Kansas didn't run mills there. They ran the inside guy on a post and a cross on the outside, and the safety was just flat-footed. He was, I think, got caught looking into the backfield, Trevor Wilson, that kid can burn. He can really run. And, with a flat-footed safety, he had no chance. Bean put that pass on the money. And all of a sudden, I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying it was total nervousness or whatever, but I do think that sort of started the buzz again, and that only intensified, Nick, when Texas has another drive down the field, gets into field goal range, and then, you have the 15-yard loss that sets up basically a 3rd and 25. They hit 14 of it back, and Burt Auburn misses another field goal. And so Kansas gets the ball back, down 6 points in the third quarter. And here's where Kansas really needed something to happen, where you would say, hey, if you go down and are able to get a touchdown here, there's that game pressure that you're talking about. Because everything that we were talking about before, Kansas is hanging around, yes, but it feels kind of fluky based on the fumble play and then one deep pass. If they could have had a drive there where they wound up scoring to take the lead, I think at that point, I don't want to say it's panic mode necessarily for Texas, but it's kind of really game on. Whereas before, Texas is saying, well, we're still leading this game, even with how badly we're playing. It's only a matter of time before something happens. Unfortunately, Kansas didn't get that drive that they needed in that moment.
Yeah, the complete opposite ended up happening for Kansas, in which Jason Bean ends up fumbling on a 4th down play. Kansas, they had a 3rd and 1, and Daniel Aisha could get the first down. They were at their own 40-ish yard line, and Lance Leipold decided to gamble and roll the dice and go for it. And I think this was definitely the right call at the time.
100%.
Unfortunately, the execution wasn't there for Kansas. They end up fumbling and not getting the first down. Texas gets the ball back, and this time they do finally get to the end zone with another Jonathan Brooks touchdown. And Texas got the ball back, and I think they realized, listen, Jonathan Brooks is running the ball well. Let's just feed him. They ran Jonathan Brooks 3 consecutive times, and then give it to him again to score the touchdown to make it 26-14. And I think that really was the moment, Kevin, where you kind of sit back and say, yep, this is where the game ended right there.
Yeah. It was Kansas had that drive. Like you said, it was, even in hindsight with Kansas not getting it, it was 100% the right call, because if you punt the ball back to Texas there, Texas just does exactly what they wound up doing, going in for a touchdown. Your chance right there was to get the first down. And even beyond scoring, which obviously would have been huge, you had to keep your defense off the field. We were talking about them being on the field a lot on a hot day. Texas winds up with 40 more plays than Kansas, and that's tough, especially when Kansas's defensive depth wasn't necessarily the strength of that roster. And so guys are playing a lot of downs. They're out there in the heat against a very physical team, and things started to wear down. It's 26-14. You say, does Kansas have one more answer kind of to go down and score and make this a one-score game again? The answer was no. They had kind of that was kind of it. Texas's defense was clicking into it, and Kansas winds up giving the ball right back to Texas and a quick 3.5.
Yeah, and then in the fourth quarter, Texas really kind of officially puts the final nails in the coffin. They go down and score a couple more touchdowns, make it 40-14, and Kansas, they had a long drive towards the end of the game with a chance to maybe try to get some points on the board, really, when the game was well in hand. Didn't work out for them. So Kansas loses this one 40-14 in Austin. And gosh, the reaction, I think, to this game was kind of a mixed bag, because on one hand, like we discussed, you look at the box score, Texas outgains Kansas by almost over 400 yards.
Yeah.
They outgained them in the game, or actually right at just over 400 yards. They outgained them 660-260. It was not necessarily a great day for the defense, but then you look up and considering the circumstances, you think, well, gosh, they didn't do great, but hey, they did the best they could given the situation. And then obviously that you turn your discourse to the quarterback situation, which is, okay, how do we kind of evaluate this game going forward for Kansas? And obviously what's the status of Jalen Daniels as well. But yeah, this was an interesting one afterwards, because you maybe weren't quite sure how to feel about it, considering how it played out and the fact that Kansas was simultaneously in the game in a one possession game late in the third quarter, while also getting outgained by 400 yards, while also really not doing anything offensively for the whole game, but without their starting quarterback. So I don't know. Maybe as you're kind of leaving the stadium on this one, what was maybe your just reaction at that time to how this game finished up?
On one hand, you hit the nail on the head with all of this. I mean, on one hand, you're kind of like the fight was outstanding. The defense got into a lot of tough positions and didn't give up. A lot of coaches will say you can win national titles by allowing field goals in the red zone. And Kansas was in a lot of tough situations where Texas didn't get max points. And you look at all the plays the defense faced. Kansas had 46 plays all day, which is not good. Texas had 46 plays in the second half. So, there's a pretty big gap there. And in the second half, Texas averaged almost 7 yards of play and wound up capping off a few more of those drives than they did before. Kansas, it doesn't look, 121 yards in the second half doesn't look great. It looks even worse when you take out a 58-yard pass. If you take out that pass play, the other 23 plays that Kansas had in the second half, 63 yards, 2.7 yards per play. And so you felt like the fight was good on both sides and that they really battled, but ultimately, it was a short-handed effort against a team that you really felt was one of the elite teams in college football. That defensive tackle duo, obviously both of those guys were high draft picks. I remember just being wowed by, Byron Murphy was terrific, but T'Vondre Sweat, I'm not sure I've seen a guy that big move as well as he did. And so for Kansas's interior offensive line to have to block those guys, that's a tough deal. And Texas had a lot of depth. It was a really good Texas team. Other than an Oklahoma game that Texas probably should have won, but kind of made a few too many mistakes the next week, Texas would have gone undefeated into the college football playoff. And so it was a really good team playing at home against a ranked team without its starting quarterback. And not just without its starting quarterback, but having Jason Bean thrown in last minute like that. Like we said, that's such a tough situation. And so you came away disappointed, obviously, and you didn't want to lose 40-14, but you did feel like, hey, the team acquitted itself fairly well given the circumstances.
Yeah, I think we'd be remiss without mentioning probably the resilience of Kansas in this game because, it could have been very easy for Kansas at any point in this game to just kind of roll over and die, right? And I think the coaching staff and Lance Leipold probably did a really good job of keeping them in it, right? And keeping them, fighting to the end. Even though the defense really, box score watching, it didn't look great. They were still fighting out there. They were still trying to make some plays. So I think some credit is deserved for the staff on that one for this game, and that's something that you can tangibly take away and apply to games going forward to the rest of the season and going forward in the future, right? And one of the things about Kansas football, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, Kevin, is that there was many times where Kansas would get down 7-0, get down 10-0, and you'd say, "Well, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. Kansas is going to lose 50-10." Boop, turn the TV off, and then that's it, right? And with Lance Leipold, we've seen now that Kansas, that's not the case anymore. That's not the case. This is a team that is worth keeping your TV on the whole time for, basically. And if K-fans didn't already know that last season, they certainly probably know it now, that Lance Leipold is building something pretty special. And even though, Kansas ends up losing by 26 in this game, I think you could still tip your hat to that idea of resilience, of still fighting, given the tough circumstances that KU faced in this game.
Yeah, some of Kansas's better moments, I feel like, on the year, not necessarily moments where people are going to jump up and say, oh, that was amazing or whatever, but came when their back was against the wall, right? When they were either shorthanded or facing a tough situation, whether it was against Oklahoma where you give the ball away late and the game appears over and they wind up getting the ball right back, going down the field and winning that. That obviously was one of the more positive ones. You have the Jason Bean injury against Texas Tech where you say, oh my gosh, Taj Brooks is running the ball really well. You've got a true freshman walk-on quarterback in his first ever college action in that situation. They come back and tie that game and have a chance there at the end. K-State, the very next game, Cole Ballard's making his first ever college start. K-State knows that Kansas probably isn't going to be able to throw the ball, and we'll get into that game more once we get there. But the resiliency, the fight, the ability to game plan against your deficiencies, I think came off really positively in that game and gave Kansas a real shot in that contest. And so this is another one where I don't think anybody's going to be sitting there 20 years from now and be like, gosh, remember that 40-14 loss to Texas? Let me sit around and tell my grandkids about it. But at the same time, those were some of their better moments in terms of showing that resiliency. And some of it was carryover from the previous year, right? They had made multiple comebacks from double digits down the previous years. Against TCU, when Jalen Daniels goes out in a tough situation, they hang around and they have a chance to win that game. They lose the Arkansas game, but they fight back from a big deficit at the end of that game. And I think that's a testament to Lance Leipold and what they've built, not just as a culture within the football team, but also within that coaching staff and the ability to kind of coach with one arm held behind your back sometimes and still give your team the best chance to win.
Well, the bad news, you lose 40-14. The good news is Texas is gone now. They're in the SEC. You don't have to worry about them for 2024 as they go to the SEC, and we'll see how they do. We'll see how they fare there. I'm sure Kansas fans will be intrigued by that to see how Texas does. But yeah, that's it for this edition of the Jayhawk Rewind. Kansas now sitting at 4-1. You lose against Texas, and certainly, obviously, all eyes turn to, okay, what's the status of Jalen Daniels? Is he going to be available again? And Kansas will come back on to take on UCF, which we'll have that as for you here on the Jayhawk Rewind next week. As we are, Kevin, I didn't even mention this. I forgot to mention this at the top of the show. We're 10 weeks away from football season.
Every time it counts down, I feel a little better in my heart because when it started off, you're like, oh my gosh, there's way too many of these. But next week we get the single digits, and
exactly.
And so we're going to start getting there. College football, people, is right around the corner.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, man. Once you get to single-digit weeks, it starts you start to feel a little more. So
the boulder's rolling downhill at that point. Yeah,
and we'll be continuing with our Jayhawk Rewind series all throughout this offseason, leading into 2024, taking you down and reminding you of what happened in 2023, thinking of some things that could look ahead to 2024 as well here with the Jayhawk Rewind series here on the Pay Podcast. That's it for this edition. Kevin Flaherty, I'm Nick Springer. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment wherever you're listening, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple or Spotify. Thanks so much for listening in. We'll be back and we'll talk to you again soon. See ya.